take a look at your own hand. Seriously, if you are not driving right now, just hold up your hand and look at it.
A very simple phenomenological exercise.
Exactly. Now, decide to close it into a fist. Think about moving it, and then do it. You just felt a distinct sense of, you making that decision.
You felt an inner voice.
Right, an executive director sitting somewhere behind your eyes, pulling the levers of your biology and commanding your muscles to act. But what if I told you that this you, your consciousness, your mind, your very soul, is a complete biological hallucination?
It is a profoundly unsettling proposition to wrap your head around.
It really is.
But if we follow the science and the logic to their absolute limits, it is the only proposition that remains standing.
And that is exactly our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into an uncompromising, rigorously intellectual framework that demands we completely rethink the foundations of human thought.
A total paradigm shift.
Yes. Now, if you are listening to this, you are probably pushing back already. You are thinking, well, I feel my consciousness. I'm experiencing this conversation right now.
The introspective certainty is very strong.
It is. And we are going to rigorously address that exact feeling. Our grounding text today is the Unified Theory of Memory, Consciousness, and Learning, or T.U.M.C.A.
Authored by the Brazilian scholar, Professor Dr. Rubens Godoy Sampaio.
Right. And our goal is to systematically deconstruct the millennial-old illusion of consciousness and intellectually establish memory as the absolute universal foundation of all mental life and biological existence.
It is a massive undertaking.
So let us rigorously unpack this framework to understand how centuries of philosophical consensus have fundamentally mischaracterized the human brain. Where do we even begin dismantling something as ingrained as the human soul?
Well, we have to begin by recognizing the sheer magnitude of the paradigm shift TUMCA demands. We are confronting a framework that requires the total elimination of consciousness as an independent existing entity.
A total elimination.
Yes. Within Sampaio's framework, consciousness, the mind, and the soul do not possess ontological reality.
Meaning they just aren't real things in the physical universe.
Precisely. They are what philosophers call an epistemological error. More specifically, they are a hypostasis.
Okay, let us stop right there and define that, because that is a very heavy piece of academic jargon. What exactly is a hypostasis?
It is the logical fallacy of treating a conceptual abstraction as if it were a real, physical, independent substance.
So turning an idea into a physical object.
Exactly. Let me give you an everyday analogy to clarify. Imagine a visitor comes to a city to see a famous university. You show them the library, the science labs, the dormitories.
The campus screens, the students.
Right, the professors lecturing. And after seeing all of this, the visitor turns to you and asks, yes, this is all wonderful, but where is the university?
I see. They're looking for a singular object called the university.
Yes, not realizing that university is just the word we use to describe the collective interaction of all those buildings and people.
They are treating a concept as a physical thing you can touch.
Exactly, and Sampaio argues that the word consciousness functions the exact same way. It is a flatus vocis.
A flatus vocis, that is Latin, right?
It is. It translates roughly to an empty utterance or a breath of voice devoid of a physical referent. It is a linguistic placeholder for a biological process we historically completely failed to comprehend.
But, how did we get here? I mean, how did the entire human race collectively agree on this massive epistemological error?
To understand the genesis of this, we really have to look backward.
Their antiquity.
We do. Because this error didn't start with modern neuroscience. It started with early human attempts to explain our own inner lives. If we look at the early Greeks, particularly in Homeric literature, we find the concept of psyche.
Right, the root of psychology.
Exactly. But originally, to a Greek soldier in the Iliad, psyche didn't mean a complex, rational mind. It simply denoted the breath of life.
So it was just the animating physical force?
The force that literally leaves the body when a warrior exhales his last breath and dies on the battlefield.
So it started as something very visceral, almost mechanical. But then it mutated over time.
It did. As we move into the Orphic and Pythagorean traditions, we see the introduction of a very dangerous philosophical idea, dualism.
The separation of mind and body.
Yes. The notion that the physical body is merely a crude prison for a pure, divine, immaterial essence. And Plato then took this idea and permanently codified it into the Western intellectual tradition.
He postulated a divine, immortal soul.
He did, and he even divided it into parts: the rational, the irascible or emotional, and the concupiscible or appetitive parts.
And Aristotle, who was usually the more grounded, biology-focused thinker of the two, he didn't exactly fix this, did he?
He tried, but ultimately he fell into the exact same trap.
Yeah.
Aristotle introduced hylomorphism.
The idea that form and matter are inherently intertwined.
Right. He argued that plants have a vegetative soul for growth and animals have a sensitive soul for perception.
And both of those are transmitted biologically, right?
Yes, through reproduction. But when it came to humans, he hit a wall. He simply couldn't explain human reason.
So what did he do?
He suggested that the intellective soul, the specific capacity for advanced human thought, must enter from the outside. He decided it must be divine in origin.
Because they simply lacked the neurobiological tools. I mean, they didn't have fMRI machines or an understanding of synaptic plasticity to explain the mechanics of thought and memory.
They had absolutely no mechanical explanation.
So they were literally forced to invent a metaphysical entity to bear the heavy lifting of our inner lives.
And this is where it gets rigorously interesting, because this is not a phenomenon unique to philosophy or theology. It is a recurring, highly predictable pattern in the history of science.
Whenever a massive explanatory gap exists.
Exactly. Humanity routinely invents substantive entities, fake things, to fill the void.
Give me an example. What kind of fake things are we talking about?
Think about the history of obsolete sciences. Before we understood the complex meteorology of atmospheric pressure, thermodynamics, and electrical charges, how did we explain lightning?
We invoked the gods of Olympus.
Zeus was the placeholder for our ignorance of electromagnetism.
Right. I don't know how that flash of light happened, so a big guy in the clouds threw it.
It is a heuristic shortcut. Or look at astronomy. Before Johannes Kepler mapped the elliptical orbits of the planets, astronomers followed the Ptolemaic model.
Which insisted all orbits were perfect circles, right?
Yes, perfect divine circles. But when they observed Mars appearing to move backward in the night sky, what we now call retrograde motion, their circular model couldn't mathematically explain it.
So what was their solution?
They invented epicycles. These were complex, completely imaginary geometric loops that the planet supposedly drove in just to make the math work.
So they invented invisible circles to save their flawed theory.
They did, and we see it in chemistry, too. When early chemists observed combustion and calcination, things burning and rusting, they couldn't explain it because they hadn't discovered oxygen yet.
So what did they invent for that?
In the 17th century, Georg Ernst Stahl postulated the existence of phlogiston.
Phlogiston. What exactly was that supposed to be?
A completely non-existent weightless element that was supposedly hidden inside all combustible materials, and it was released during burning.
Why?
And this pattern continued even into the late 19th century. Physicists couldn't fathom how light waves could travel through the empty vacuum of space.
Because sound needs air, and water waves need water.
Exactly. So they hypothesized the luminiferous ether.
Right. An invisible, omnipresent, entirely undetectable medium that filled the universe.
Just so light had something to physically ripple through.
But these were all conceptual phantoms. Epicycles, phlogiston, the ether, the Olympian gods. They were all just band-aids for our ignorance.
They were hypothetical substances created to explain observable phenomena that lacked a mechanical explanation. And Sampaio's framework insists with absolute rigor that consciousness, the mind, and the soul belong strictly to this category of obsolete scientific concepts.
Consciousness is the phlogiston of neuroscience.
That is precisely the argument.
Wait, hold on. You are comparing my self-awareness, my deepest thoughts, the very voice reading this script in my head right now, to Georg Ernst Stahl's fake phlogiston element.
I am.
That is a massive pill to swallow.
Yeah.
I have to challenge this from a phenomenological standpoint.
Please do.
If we look at the introspective certainty of the individual, the undeniable visceral feeling of possessing a self, the classic Cartesian, I think therefore I am, it is incredibly convincing.
It is the most convincing illusion in biology.
But it is as visually and cognitively obvious to me as the fact that the sun appears to orbit the Earth every day. I experience my own awareness continuously. How do we scientifically redefine this undeniable subjective experience without falling back into the very dualism we are attempting to destroy?
We apply Occam's razor with absolute ruthless precision.
Entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem.
Entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. We must strip away every unnecessary assumption. Now, the subjective experience you are referring to, that feeling of you, is absolutely real.
Okay, good, because I was starting to panic a little bit.
The phenomenon is physically happening. Sampaio is not saying you are a philosophical zombie devoid of inner life.
Right.
However, assigning that feeling the noun consciousness and treating it as a discrete entity, a glowing orb in your head or a separate hierarchical supervisor managing your brain, is a profound categorical error.
We have to remove the ghost from the machine.
The dualistic ghost in the machine must be violently excised. What you are experiencing, that constant streaming narrative of subjective self-awareness, is not a thing called consciousness.
No, what is it?
It is simply memory acting recursively. It is the biological process of memory continuously referencing its own active contents.
Okay, let me make sure I am wrapping my head around this. If we take the ghost out of the machine, what is actually driving the car?
We have to restructure our entire understanding of the brain.
Because having successfully dismantled the independent existence of consciousness and the soul, we are left with a massive conceptual void in our cognitive architecture.
A void that must be filled.
Right. If the mind is not the boss sitting in the corner office of our brain, this void must be filled by redefining the brain's true center. Which brings us to the core theoretical pillar of the T.U.M.C.A. framework, the Copernican revolution of the brain.
Sampaio calls this mnemocentrism.
Mnemocentrism, memory at the center.
This is the paradigm shift we must undergo. For centuries, our understanding of the brain yes, centered around consciousness or the mind as the primary executive function. Mnemocentrism demands that we undergo a shift identical in magnitude to the cosmological shift from a geocentric universe, where humans arrogantly placed Earth immobile at the center of everything.
To a heliocentric universe.
Exactly, where we finally accepted that the sun is the undisputed gravitational core.
We have to dethrone consciousness.
We have to abandon the syneidocentric model completely. Memory is not a subservient storage drive.
It's not a hard drive?
No. It is not a dusty, passive archive in the basement of your brain, waiting to be accessed by a higher executive power called the mind. Memory is the absolute center, the sun of all brain functions.
To really elucidate this shift, because it fundamentally changes cognitive taxonomy, we need to talk about a crucial metaphor from the source material, the metaphor of the spoon and cutting objects.
A brilliant heuristic tool.
Imagine you are holding a simple, everyday spoon. You use this single utensil to eat a bowl of hot soup. Later, you use it to stir sugar into your coffee.
Right.
Later still, you use it to scoop up a heavy dessert. Throughout all these highly varied physical actions, you never change the name of the tool. It remains, ontologically and practically, a spoon.
Exactly. You do not invent a separate soup-eating entity.
Or a magical sugar-stirring faculty.
You recognize it is one single tool being applied to completely different contexts.
Yet, when we look at the human brain utilizing memory to execute complex mathematical calculations, or to articulate speech, or to plan a schedule for next week, we fall into a massive linguistic and scientific trap.
We invent false, discrete entities.
We do. We label the use of memory in numbers as a distinct faculty called mathematical reasoning. We label its use in vocalization as a separate module called language.
We label its use in anticipating the future as executive functions or volition.
We categorize them as entirely separate tools, like an array of specialized cutting objects. We think we have a scalpel for math, a sword for language, a scythe for planning.
But Sampaio is rigorously arguing that no, there are no cutting objects.
There is only the spoon.
There is only memory.
What is absolutely fascinating here is the sheer explanatory power of this metaphor. If we accept that there is no separate module for intelligence, no independent biological faculty for free will, no distinct engine for imagination.
We essentially unify the entire fractured field of cognitive science.
So what we call free will is basically just us pretending the spoon is a magic wand, when really it is just the same spoon doing a different physical motion.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Let us look at imagination, for instance. Historically, we have viewed imagination as a mystical, separate creative force, an ethereal muse.
Right, something distinctly non-mechanical.
But under mnemocentrism, imagination is simply the fluid, unregulated, associative flow of memory.
So it is just memory recombining past fragments.
Yes, into novel configurations without strict environmental constraints.
And reason, the grand defining characteristic of human beings.
Reason is not a divine spark of infallible logic. Reason is simply memory organized by internalized, memorized rules.
So when I am reasoning, I am just remembering rules.
You memorize grammatical syntax, you memorize mathematical axioms, you memorize the laws of cause and effect through physical interaction with the world. When you reason through a problem, you are simply constraining the flow of your memory through those previously memorized gates.
So all of what we grandly term higher cognitive functions do not exist in themselves.
They do not. They are merely different contextual applications, modulations, and articulations of a single, unified biological tool.
Memory. Okay, so if it is all just memory, this necessitates an immediate mechanical inquiry. I need to know how this physically works.
The mechanics are crucial.
Because if consciousness is not an entity, not a separate faculty, and not a supervisor, what precisely produces the visceral experience of being self-aware? If it is all just the spoon of memory, how does the spoon realize it is a spoon?
It comes back to recursion.
The framework asserts that consciousness is merely the name we mistakenly give to the precise moment when memory acts recursively. It is memory folding upon itself.
Yes.
To clarify the mechanics of this recursion, we have to examine another brilliant metaphor from the text, the paper airplane.
The paper airplane is an exceptionally precise analogy for understanding the emergence of incredibly complex properties without the addition of any new metaphysical substance.
Walk us through it.
Consider a standard, flat, blank sheet of A4 paper. In its default state, its physical properties are basic. It has a certain mass, a certain flexibility, but it basically just sits there on the desk.
It is inert.
However, if you subject that exact same single sheet of paper to a series of precise, recursive folds, it transforms into an origami airplane.
And suddenly, it behaves entirely differently.
Exactly. Through those structural folds, it suddenly gains aerodynamic properties, it gains lift, it generates drag, and it gains the astonishing ability to glide through the air.
It flies.
Now ask yourself, have you added a motor to the paper?
No.
Have you injected it with magical aerodynamic fluid? Have you infused it with a tiny flight soul?
Obviously not. You've added absolutely zero new material.
The mass is identical, the chemical composition is identical. The new operational properties, the gliding, are strictly the result of the material acting upon itself.
Folding into a new structure.
And consciousness is merely memory folded upon itself. In our brains, our working memory maintains active, firing representations of the external world and our internal states.
And when the brain's dense cortical circuitry allows those memory traces to loop back.
And index themselves. When the memory physically remembers what it is currently remembering, it folds.
Wow.
And through that fold, it gains the operational property of self-reflection. We gain the aerodynamic lift to monitor our own thoughts, report on them, and glide through a temporal narrative of past, present, and future.
But no metaphysical soul has been added to the biological substrate.
None whatsoever. It is just folded memory.
That is profound. It is just neural pathways retaining active representations and looping them back into the input stream. But we have to be extremely careful not to fall back into our old linguistic traps here.
The trap of hypostasis.
Right, which is why we need to discuss another core metaphor, the metaphor of the bath. We have to strictly separate the action from the noun, otherwise we are going to hypostasize consciousness all over again.
Yes, the metaphor of the bath is vital to curing our inherent linguistic tendency to turn actions into things.
So when an individual takes a bath, what is actually occurring mechanically and physically?
It is the physical body washing its own physical body.
Right. The bath itself is not an entity.
You cannot capture a bath in a glass jar.
No.
The bath is not a magical force that acts upon you from the outside. And crucially, the bath is not recursive.
It is the body that is acting recursively upon itself.
Exactly. The bath is merely the transient event. It is the resulting state of cleanliness.
And similarly, consciousness is not recursive.
No, consciousness is not an entity that sits there and reflects upon things. It is the memory that is recursive.
Consciousness is just the transient, subjective event
The bath.
produced by this continuous physical looping action of memory circuits. Here is where the theoretical implications become profoundly interesting and honestly a bit mind-bending. By postulating that consciousness is simply memory indexing itself, how does the brain sustain this recursive loop without falling into an infinite regress?
Ah, the classic philosophical trap.
Right, because if you are a student of philosophy, you know this is the classic homunculus problem in the philosophy of mind.
The little man inside the head.
Exactly. If the memory is reading the memory, who is reading the reader? If we require a center of unification to make sense of all these memories, do we not inevitably require a tiny supervisor for that center and then another supervisor for that supervisor ad infinitum?
It is a logical nightmare if you maintain a dualistic framework.
So how does T.U.M.C.A. scientifically solve the homunculus problem?
It solves it by rigorously connecting human neurobiology to the broader mechanics of biological systems. We find the solution in the concept of autopoiesis.
Autopoietic, meaning self-organizing systems.
Yes. Memory is an autopoietic system. It does not require a homunculus to observe it because it inherently indexes its own contents through biochemical and synaptic reentry.
Okay, unpack autopoietic for us. How does a system organize itself without an external organizer pulling the strings?
Let us use an analogy Sampaio leans on. Think about Carl Linnaeus.
The father of modern taxonomy.
Correct. Linnaeus created a system to organize biological life. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
Right, biological categorization.
Now, consider the category of mammal. Does the category mammal physically exist in nature? Can you point to the abstract concept of a mammal?
No, I mean, I can point to a dog or a whale or a human. The physical entities exist.
Exactly. Mammal is a conceptual abstraction generated by observing specific physical entities that possess hair and mammary glands. It is a macro category organizing microdata.
So the abstraction arises from the data itself.
Yes. Or consider mathematics, where ordinal numbers, first, second, third, are abstractions built directly from cardinal numbers 1, 2, 3.
They don't exist independently.
Right. Memory operates identically in the physical brain. It is constantly creating layers of abstraction. It scans its own lower-level sensory contents and abstracts them to reduce computational load.
It creates macro representations of its own microstates.
Precisely. It is continuously compressing data.
And this continuous self-referential scanning and data compression generates the cohesive singular narrative we mistakenly call the ego or the self.
The ego is just the biological index of the autobiography.
There is no homunculus reading the book.
There is only the book continuously writing its own index through synaptic feedback loops.
Wow. The ego is just the biological index of the autobiography. That completely reframes how I think about my own internal monologue.
It removes the magic and leaves the incredible biology.
Having grounded this mechanism within the neurobiology of the human brain, we have to expand the scope of this framework outward.
Yes, we must look at the entire biological continuum.
Because Sampaio does not stop at the human skull. He asserts that memory is not merely a neurological phenomenon confined to complex organisms like primates or dolphins.
Not at all.
He argues it is the fundamental condition of life itself. Life itself is essentially a form of memory. This introduces the concept of the polymorphism of memory.
The polymorphism of memory is perhaps the most sweeping aspect of TUMCA. It is the recognition that this exact same mechanism of retention and recursion exists in stratified, interoperable layers across all biological reality.
So memory takes many forms, but the underlying principle is identical.
Yes. We can identify 5 distinct evolutionary layers of this polymorphism.
Let us rigorously walk through them because this really builds a phenomenal mental theater. The first layer is the biogenetic.
Yes, biogenetic memory is memory at the absolute fundamental cellular level. It is encoded in the physical molecular structure of DNA and RNA.
And this links everything together.
It links every living thing directly back to LUCA.
The last universal common ancestor.
Correct. We have to stop thinking of evolution merely as random change over time and realize that natural selection is fundamentally a mechanism for memory distillation.
How so? Give me an example of a single cell remembering something.
Imagine a primordial environment billions of years ago. A single-celled organism encounters a highly acidic environment that threatens its structural integrity.
It's facing destruction.
It happens to have a random genetic mutation that allows it to excrete a neutralizing protein, so it survives while the others die.
Right, basic natural selection.
But that survival and the reproduction that follows encodes the memory of how to survive acid into the genetic structure. It passes that structural memory forward over billions of years.
So your very DNA is an ancient, sprawling library.
It is a library of billions of years of trial, error, and survival. It is molecular memory.
That is incredible, and that naturally leads us to the second layer, which is phylogenetic memory. This is the memory of the entire species, operating above the single cell but below individual consciousness.
Correct. Phylogenetic memory drives massive physical adaptations and instinctual fixed action behaviors over deep evolutionary time.
I always think of sea turtles when we talk about instinct. When a newly hatched sea turtle breaks out of its egg on a dark beach, it has never met its parents. It has never seen the ocean.
It has no personal experience whatsoever.
Yet it instinctively knows to frantically crawl toward the brightest horizon, which, before artificial lighting, was always the reflection of the moon on the ocean.
Yes.
We call that instinct, but Sampaio's saying that is literally a memory. It is the accumulated lived experience of millions of generations of turtles successfully surviving by moving toward the light, physically burned into the neurology of the hatchling.
It is entirely memory. It is not a metaphor. It is the physical retention of past successful actions by the species.
Fascinating. Now, moving up, the third layer is ontogenetic memory.
Yes. This dictates the developmental pathways from a fertilized embryo to a fully mature organism.
So how a body builds itself.
How does a cluster of identical stem cells know to differentiate into a liver cell, a neuron, or a piece of bone?
It remembers.
Exactly. It is following a deeply ingrained memory of the sequence of cellular differentiation required to build a functional, specific body.
And that brings us to the fourth layer, which is where we usually focus all our attention, neuronal or personal memory.
Yes. This is the cognitive memory of the individual organism. It is gathered through its unique sensory interactions with its specific immediate environment during its lifetime.
And it is strictly within this fourth layer that the dense, recursive loops of working memory we discussed earlier, the paper airplane folds, create the persistent, subjective illusion of consciousness and selfhood.
That is correct. But as you noted, Sampaio does not stop at the boundary of the skull.
No.
The fifth and final layer is cultural memory. And this is where things accelerate exponentially. This represents the ultimate externalization of memory.
It is the defining feature of human hyperevolution.
Absolutely. Through the invention of spoken language, oral traditions, the written word, libraries, mathematics, and now the internet, humanity has managed to do something astonishing.
We have learned to store our memory outside our own biological tissue,
We have outsourced the substrate of memory.
which completely breaks the speed limit of evolution, because biogenetic memory requires thousands of generations to adapt to a problem. But cultural memory lets us adapt in a single afternoon.
It is a massive evolutionary hack.
Think about an instrument like the James Webb Space Telescope currently floating 1 million miles away in space. It is not merely a machine made of beryllium and gold.
No, it is a monument to externalized memory.
It is the physical, towering manifestation of thousands of years of accumulated, culturally externalized mathematical and physical memory. It contains the externalized memories of Newton, of Einstein, of thousands of engineers, all layered together, completely transcending the slow, brutal constraints of Darwinian biological timeframes.
That is exactly the perspective we need. But while we celebrate the James Webb Telescope, this polymorphism forces a devastating reevaluation of our place in the cosmos.
Because it pulls the rug out from under our pride.
Precisely. The realization that our highest, most sophisticated, most beautiful cognitive achievements, writing a Beethoven symphony, calculating orbital mechanics, debating philosophy, are mechanically merely complex extensions of the exact same biogenetic memory found in single-celled amoebas completely shatters the illusion of humanity's special status.
We are operating on the exact same fundamental biological substrate as the simplest bacteria.
We just have more folds in our paper airplane.
Which brings us to the ultimate, inescapable, and perhaps most painful conclusion of this entire deep dive. The culmination of the T.U.M.C.A. framework is what Sampaio rigorously identifies as the seventh neurological humiliation.
A very specific historical framing.
Humanity is faced with a strict scientific mandate to violently abandon its deeply ingrained narcissism and the persistent myth of human exceptionalism. We must systematically dethrone ourselves.
To truly understand the gravity of this seventh humiliation, we have to contextualize it historically.
We have to look at the historical trajectory of scientific humiliations that have progressively, century by century, stripped humanity of its cosmic arrogance.
Yes, we have suffered 6 major blows to our ego before this.
Let us walk through them, because it really paints a picture of a species being repeatedly told it is not the center of the universe.
The first was the cosmological humiliation, delivered by Nicholas Copernicus in 1543.
Yes, for millennia we believed the Earth sat immobile at the absolute center of God's universe.
Geocentrism.
Copernicus mathematically proved that we are not the center. We are merely a minor wet rock orbiting a rather average minor star. He destroyed our spatial centrality.
Then came the second blow, the biological humiliation, delivered by Charles Darwin in 1859.
A profound shock to the system. On the origin of species, proved that we are not the product of a special, divine, customized creation in the Garden of Eden. We are descendants of a common evolutionary tree, subject to the exact same blind, indifferent forces of natural selection as a pigeon or a worm.
The third was the psychological humiliation. This is also deeply rooted in Darwin's later work on the expression of emotions and later popularized by psychoanalysis.
Right, Freud and the unconscious.
It revealed that we are not perfectly rational actors. We share deep unconscious drives, aggressive impulses, and profound emotional states, fear, joy, maternal affection, directly with the animal kingdom.
We are driven by ancient, hidden biological imperatives, not just pure reason.
The fourth was the genetic humiliation, which arrived in the mid-20th century with the mapping of DNA.
Which proved with cold, undeniable chemical certainty that we share nearly our entire genetic code with primates.
We are fundamentally built from the exact same molecular blueprints as chimpanzees and bonobos. There is no special human chemistry.
The fifth is the chronological humiliation. When we finally learn to read the geological record and understand the concept of deep time, we were humbled by our incredibly brief tenure on this planet.
The Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old.
And our species, Homo sapiens, has existed for perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 years. If the history of Earth were a 24-hour clock, we arrived in the last few seconds before midnight.
We are an absolute evolutionary afterthought in the history of the planet.
Yet we behave as its eternal, divinely appointed masters.
And the sixth was the cognitive humiliation brought about by early 20th century quantum mechanics.
The destruction of deterministic physics.
The principles articulated by Werner Heisenberg with his uncertainty principle and Max Planck completely destroy the Enlightenment illusion that human reason could eventually achieve perfect deterministic knowledge of the universe.
We learn that the universe at its fundamental level is probabilistic.
We are fundamentally limited in what we can precisely measure and know. The universe does not owe us comprehensibility.
And now, building upon those 6 foundational blows to our collective, species-wide ego, Sampaio articulates the 7th humiliation, the neurological humiliation.
The final nail in the coffin of human exceptionalism.
We must accept that we do not possess a divine spark. We do not have an elevated ethereal mind that exists distinctly and superiorly from the rest of the animal kingdom.
Our entire mental life, everything we hold sacred about our subjective experience, our complex reasoning, our breathtaking art, our deepest loves, our loftiest philosophy.
It is all simply the flow of memory.
It is a strictly biological process of data retention and synaptic recursion, completely devoid of any metaphysical privilege.
But wait. If our perceived intellectual superiority is merely a quantitative expansion of recursive memory, meaning we just have more memory capacity, rather than a qualitative magical metaphysical leap, how do we scientifically define the human condition now? What are we?
It means we must accept our profound biological ordinariness. Sampaio's framework defines us not by our souls, but by our architecture.
So it's just a structural difference.
We are merely animals with a highly optimized, expanded cortical capacity. Our true evolutionary advantage was not that a god breathed the soul into us. It was simply a mutation resulting in a neurological architecture that allows for holding multiple disparate items in our working memory simultaneously.
Because our brains can hold more active data, we permit incredibly dense recursive loops.
The paper airplane has more folds. That is it.
We are firmly placed within the evolutionary continuum, shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the biosphere.
Yes. The 7th humiliation strips away the religious, philosophical, and anthropocentric arrogance that has defined Western thought for over 2 millennia.
We are not fallen angels cast out of heaven.
We are simply highly retentive, incredibly complex apes.
We have covered a massive intellectual terrain today. We have mapped the historical genesis of our cognitive illusions from Homer to Aristotle.
We have dismantled the hypostasis of consciousness.
We have utilized the brilliant metaphors of the paper airplane and the spoon to finally understand the physical mechanics of memory's recursion without falling into dualism.
We have traced the polymorphic layers of memory from the very first LUCA cell-dodging acid all the way to the James Webb Telescope peering into the dawn of time.
And finally, we have subjected ourselves to the 7th neurological humiliation. You, the listener, must now confront the reality of an intellect entirely composed of folded memory.
The intellectual rigor demanded by the T.U.M.C.A. framework leaves absolutely no room for the comforting ghosts of the past. The hypostasis of consciousness must be abandoned if we are to truly understand ourselves scientifically.
Which leaves us with a final, profound philosophical implication for you to explore independently. And this is something I really want you to chew on after this deep dive ends. If our entire perceived reality, our ego, our rational thought, and our complex planning for the future are merely the biological reverberations of recursive memory, meaning they are made of the exact same fundamental material substrate found in all living organisms across the planet, how must this completely rewrite our ethical frameworks?
A profound question.
If there is no ontological difference, no magical soul separating our mind from the biogenetic memory of the rest of the biosphere, what are our moral obligations toward the other species with whom we share this fragile material existence? It is a question that demands an answer now that the illusion of our superiority is gone. It is mandatory to conclude by formally stating that the academic material rigorously analyzed in this deep dive was curated and authored by the Brazilian scholar Professor Dr. Rubens Godoy Sampaio. For all academic inquiries regarding the unified theory of memory, consciousness, and learning, the author's direct contact is as follows. Email at rgsampa@hotmail.com and WhatsApp at +55 182 996 79 1223.